All right, welcome back to the Brea Church of Christ here in North Orange County, California. This is lesson 1-6. This is going to be the last lesson in this series about how to approach God using the Bible, how to look at the Bible and derive authority from it. And in this lesson, we're going to be talking about our singing in worship. We're going to be talking about what did God reveal to us? How does He want us to worship Him in song in our worship, in our churches today? Almost every church recognizes that there is singing, there is music to one degree or another. Some churches will have the whole congregation sing. Others will have a band and some singers, and they're the only ones that sing. Or maybe you can sing along with them, but definitely they're the highlighted act. Others will have a choir of some of the best singers you've ever heard, and the audience will listen to the choir. Some will just have singers and music of some other brand, some other way. So there's all sorts of things done for worship and music in the church. But what does God command of us? Some people say, well, again, it doesn't matter. All you have to do is, all He commands is for us to sing, and how we sing, it's up to us. Well, again, that's kind of a very dangerous thing, because as we've seen in this series, God tells us not only that He wants us to sing, but how He wants us to sing. It's also scary because there's a lot of churches that do not encourage everyone to sing. And so there's people that just listen to others who sing. There's people who would love to sing, but they're not the greatest singers, so they can't be part of the music group or the choir. And so we invite you to study with us. This is going to be, again, an A and a B part, so we'll shorten it up. But as we start, again, what are we going to be looking for? We're going to be looking for specific authority. What has God commanded of us? We're going to be looking for New Testament commands and New Testament examples. How did the first century Christians, those New Testament Christians, how did they sing praises to God in worship? When we look at those commands and we look at those examples, we're going to ask those questions: who, what, where, when, why, how. And we're going to glean all that information. Then we're going to take a look at our times where God hasn't said anything. We're going to look at generic authority. We're going to look at God's silence. We're going to find, by doing that, the pattern for singing in the Word of God. So I want to start off with a little bit of singing, some history, biblical history in singing. I think most of us know that in the Old Testament, there was no organized singing or playing of music prior to David. We do have examples of certain of God's people singing praises to Him, but there's no command. Even at the tabernacle, there was no command for singing or music of any kind. It wasn't until David made plans to build the temple. Of course, it would be Solomon that would build it. That we start to see singing at God's house. And in that, David had music writers, psalmists, if you will. He had Levites that would sing. He had Levites that would play instruments. And oftentimes in the Psalms, the instrument for that particular psalm is included, or instruments. And so an organized command to sing praises to God in worship doesn't really come about until the temple is built in the time of David and really gets started in the time of Solomon. And there are actually people that believe that David had no authority to sing with instruments, that he added the instruments, and God did not want that. God was displeased with that. One of the passages that they use is from the prophet Amos. Let's look at Amos chapter 6 and in verse 5. As you take a look at Amos, you're going to see that in this part of the prophet's message, that he is giving them a series of warnings, or as the Bible calls them, woes. Woe to you, or woe to those. And so part of this warning is to the rich, sinful Israelites. And so as you look at verse 5, he's warning those who impoverish the sound of the harp, and like David have composed songs for themselves. And so a lot of people take a look and say, look, Amos is condemning them, and he uses the condemnation of David, how he, and what's the actual word here, composed songs for himself. And they will take that as David created this against God's will. And so they would make the point that David should never have used those instruments. Well, I want to ask you, is that true? Did David use instruments against the will of God? Well, let's go over to 2 Chronicles. Let's take a look at 2 Chronicles, and we're going to look at chapter 29. 2 Chronicles 29, it's going to be up on the screen here. Let me try to turn there real quick. And we're going to look at verse 25 and 26. All right, verse 25. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and harps and with lyres, according to the command of David and of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet. For the command was from the Lord through his prophets. The Levites stood with the musical instruments of David, and the priest with the trumpets. So what we're reading here is the story of King Hezekiah. And King Hezekiah is restoring that temple worship. You see, in the days of Hezekiah, Israel was, again, breaking covenant with God. They were not worshiping him as they should in the temple. And now Hezekiah is bringing that back. And notice that it tells us in verse 25 that he brought back the Levites at the temple, the house of the Lord, with those musical instruments, the cymbals, the harps, the lyres. But then it tells us that all of that came not only of the command of David, but came through two prophets. The prophets Gad and the prophet Nathan. And then tells us very clearly that this command for the Levites, the musical instruments, was from the Lord through his prophets. So, to make a point that David just made this up, contradicts that very passage. No, it shows that God did command that, and therefore David composed it. David created that whole music with musical instruments as they worship God at the temple. Secondly, there is no statement by God against David, as if David had done something wrong by having these musical instruments. And third, throughout Israel's history, there were times where they were disobedient to God and they stopped worshiping, they stopped singing to God. And then there would be a king that would come back and he would restore that New Testament worship. Well, every time that happened, the musical instruments were added to the temple worship. So, to make a point that in the Old Testament, David just made that up, it wasn't from God, is not correct. It truly was from God. And so, whenever they worshiped throughout their history in the temple, when there was music, there was singing, and there were musical instruments, and the Levites were in charge of leading all of that. But something interesting happened. As we know, Israel and then later Judah disobeyed God. They refused to listen to God's prophet. And so he brought the nation of Assyria and captured Israel and led them away into captivity. And then he brought the Babylonians later, and they captured Judah, and they led them away from captivity. And they what? They burned the fireless city, and they burned and tore down the temple of God. Well, during this period, there was no temple. The people were not in the land of promise. They were in captivity. They were in the land of Babylon. And so what started happening is the people started to learn or develop a worship of God outside of the temple. After 70 years of captivity, God allowed them to come back in the land. But even then, many of the Jews either remained in Babylon and lived there the rest of their lives, or some left Babylon, but they didn't go back to the promised land. They dispersed through the Greek or Hellenistic world. And so, for example, when Paul does his missionary journeys, he's in the Greek-Roman world, but these cities he goes to, there are Jews. Jews living in Troas, Jews living in Ephesus or Thessalonica or Corinth, not in the promised land. And what starts to develop, apparently, after captivity, perhaps during the intertestamental period, maybe even earlier, is worship, what we might call local worship. They develop a place in which on the Sabbath day they go and they worship God. And that place where they worship comes to be known as the synagogue. And so 3 times a year, they're commanded to go to Jerusalem and worship at the temple. But all the other times, they're at home, wherever they live. And each Sabbath, each week, they gather in the synagogue and they worship God. Well, that synagogue worship was made up of several things. There was the reading of Scripture. And then after the reading of Scripture, different Jewish men would discuss, teach, talk about things of God or the passage they just read. There would also be times of prayer in the synagogue, and as well, they would sing praises to God. They would sing psalms to God. But here's the interesting thing. When they worshiped at the temple, they worshiped with song and instruments, accompanied by instruments. But when they worshiped in the synagogue away from the temple, they worshiped and they sang with voices only. We're going to, just for our purpose, we're going to call it vocal singing. Or you might like the term a cappella. A cappella to us means without instruments, just singing with the voice. Well, originally the term a cappella meant to sing as in the church, as in the chapel. And that gives us a little indication that when the church started, the church really looked more like synagogue worship and not temple worship. And so the Jews of that time saw that when they were at the temple, there was scriptural authority to sing praises to God, to sing psalms with instruments of music. But they must have seen that that authority to sing with instruments was only at the temple. Because in the synagogue, they didn't use instruments. They only sang with the voice. I want to show you some quotes here. The first one is from a lectureship by a professor by the name of Melvin Curry. And he was talking about instrumental music in worship. And what he says, he actually quotes from Richard E. Wolfe in a writing called Songs, Cymbals, and Tambourines. He says, unlike the temple, the synagogue employed no instruments in its service. Melvin Curry went on to say this: when psalms were later used in the synagogues, they were sung a cappella, regardless of what instruments are mentioned. Apparently, when instruments were cited in a psalm, later Jews did not understand the use of instruments as mandatory in non-temple worship. So here are some men who've studied ancient Jewish worship in the synagogue. And they say very clearly that even when they sang psalms in the synagogue, even if that psalm back in the Old Testament said, here's the instruments that are to accompany this psalm, they did not see that as mandatory. That there was a reason they saw no authority. And so they sang the psalm, but they did not use the instrument. I want to look at another quote, this one by William M. Green, who wrote a writing called The Church Fathers and Musical Instruments, one of the best articles on musical instruments in the ancient times, or music in the ancient times. The article, as you can see, goes all the way back to 1966. And this is one of the things he notices. He says the rites of the synagogue consisted of reading from the scriptures, discourse, teaching, prayers, and the singing of psalms. There was no sacrifice and apparently no instrumental music. The Talmud states that instruments were prohibited by the rabbis out of mourning over the destruction of the temple. So he even gives the idea that the rabbinical writings or commentaries talked about that they didn't use them because it was a sign of mourning that the temple has been destroyed. So I want you to think about this. The Jews had two types of worship. They had temple worship. What was temple worship? Well, it was one location. Everyone had to go to Jerusalem if they wanted to worship at the temple. And it was singing with instruments. But they also had synagogue worship. What was synagogue worship? Well, there wasn't just one like the temple. There were several synagogues, local synagogues. And so in a city, a town, if there was enough Jews, then they could build a synagogue. And there was singing and their worship to God, but without instruments. They must have seen that had no authority, only at the temple. Well, let's move ahead now into the time of the New Testament, the time where the New Testament church starts. We know as the gospel is spreading, like in the book of Acts, that people are converted to Christ and churches are started. The church then begins to worship God. They are taught by the apostles how to authoritatively worship God, much like we're talking about in this series of lessons. Well, let's kind of compare the church and its worship to the two types of Jewish worship. What was church worship more like? Was it more like temple worship or synagogue worship? Well, I think you can tell that it fit the pattern more of the synagogue worship. There wasn't just one congregation. There turned out to be several local congregations. When they worshiped, the Christians in that city, that town, went to a particular place. The building was not important. Most of the time they worshipped in houses. Paul worshipped in a schoolhouse or in a school building at one point with that particular church. They didn't consider the building, the location, to be the house of God, other than Christians were there, and God was dwelling in the lives and the hearts of those Christians. But when they sang in the church, in the New Testament church, without instruments. They sang like they did in the synagogue. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that the Christians just adopted a synagogue worship. It is clear that they didn't. What I'm trying to say is that it models it. And that it models it because God commanded it to be that way. But was it simply a synagogue worship now in the church? No. They had also a collection that they took up every first day of the week. They got together, and the major part of their worship, the main part of their worship or focus of their worship, was the partaking of the Lord's Supper. That's not what we had in synagogue worship. I want to take a look at some more quotes here. I want to look at this quote. This goes back to William Green's article. He quotes or talks about Eric Warner, which at that time he was the professor of liturgical music at the Hebrew Union College. And he says Eric Warner declares that the Jews rejected instruments as a direct reaction against the instruments of pagan cults. So you can see he's saying that Jews also had another reason for not singing with instruments. What we're stating is that those might have been true as well, but it was one of authority. So we want to turn our attention to the New Testament and passages in the New Testament that talk about New Testament Christian singing. But let's go ahead and stop our lesson at this point. And we'll start there in lesson 1-6b. And what we're going to see, both in the Bible and in historical writings, it is very clear that Christians, when they worship God in worship, sang praises to Him. They sung hymns and psalms and spiritual songs, but they did not use instruments. They sang vocally. They sang a cappella. They sang with the voice and the heart. And if we're going to go back to the Bible, what we're trying to do is do exactly what God revealed. There's got to be a reason that these Christians did that. And the reason is because that's what they were taught. was authorized by God. And so let's go ahead and end this lesson. We thank you for studying with us. We hope that this all makes sense. But in our next lesson, we'll make it even clearer as we take a look at these New Testament passages. Again, please write to us, call us, email us. Here's our information. We thank you so much for studying with us, and we'll see you in lesson 1-6B.